Molly wasn't supposed to be blocks away from home at this hour. Puffy eyes, trembling hands, and a bright red sweater that looked like a drop of blood against the gray pavement of a neighborhood where even the police didn't like to linger. She clutched her teddy bear like a shield, walking straight toward the one place everyone else hurried past. The headquarters of the man the streets called the Ghost of Seoul. Kang Jae-Won was leaning against his luxury SUV, the light from his lighter illuminating the sharp ink crawling up his neck, when the little girl stopped inches from his polished shoes. She was too small, too fragile, and far too desperate for a place like this. "Please," she whispered, her voice fracturing in the cold air. "He hurt my grandma." The flame of the lighter flickered and died. The silent, suit-clad men standing like statues around the vehicles turned as one. The air itself seemed to freeze. "Who?" Kang asked. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, terrifying whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. Molly's chin wobbled as she pointed a shaky finger toward the porch where her grandmother, Ellen, sat clutching her chest in the shadows, while a predatory figure loomed in the doorway, smirking as if he were untouchable. Kang's jaw tightened. He knew that smirk. It was the look of a man who thought he could prey on the weak because the system was too slow to stop him. "He hit her," Molly sobbed, "because the money wasn't enough." Kang Jae-Won didn't rage. He didn't swear. He simply stood up, adjusted his cuffs, and looked at his lead bodyguard. He didn't have to say a word. One sharp nod was all it took. Within seconds, a fleet of black SUVs roared to life, their headlights cutting through the darkness like predators on the hunt. What happened when those doors opened in front of Ellen's house would be whispered about in the neighborhood for years. The night a monster decided to become a guardian. Stay with me until the end, because the secret Kang Jae-Won uncovered inside that house didn't just save a grandmother. It changed the Mafia Boss forever. But before we reveal the reckoning, make sure to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Let's begin. The streetlights in the Riverside district didn't just flicker. They seemed to surrender to the encroaching shadows. For Ellen Holder, those shadows had always been manageable, kept at bay by the warmth of her kitchen and the soft hum of the hymns she sang to Molly. But tonight, the darkness had grown teeth. It had started an hour earlier. Ellen had been sitting on the top step of her porch, the wood cool against her skin, watching Molly play with her teddy bear in the small patch of grass. The evening air was thick with the scent of rain and the distant, rhythmic thumping of bass from a passing car. Beside the door stood Jeffrey, a man whose presence was as sturdy as the oak trees lining the block. He was more than a neighbor. He was the silent sentinel of the building, a man of few words but immense strength. "Everything quiet tonight, Jeffrey?" Ellen had asked, her voice carrying the soft, melodic lilt of a woman who had spent decades smoothing over the world's rough edges. "Quiet as it gets, Miss Ellen," Jeffrey had replied, his arms crossed over his white tank top, his eyes scanning the street with a weary, practiced vigilance. But the quiet was a lie. A phone call had pulled Jeffrey away, a frantic message about his sister 3 blocks over. It was the kind of distraction designed specifically to leave a door unguarded. The moment Jeffrey's heavy footsteps faded into the distance, a rusted sedan had rounded the corner, its engine whining like a wounded animal. Tommy Rohr didn't walk, he prowled. He stepped out of the car, the cheap silver chain around his neck glinting in the pale moonlight. He was a man who lived in the margins of other people's misery, a small-time predator who mistook the fear of the elderly for his own power. "Where's the envelope, Ellen?" he had sneered, skipping the pleasantries as he reached the bottom step. The smell of stale beer and desperation preceded him. "I told the office, Tommy. The laundromat is behind on payroll. I'll have it by Friday," Ellen said, her voice steady even as she felt the first sharp prick of alarm. She placed a hand over her chest, feeling her heart begin a frantic, uneven rhythm. "Friday doesn't pay my tab tonight," Tommy spat. He lunged forward, his movement sudden and jagged. Ellen tried to stand, but her knees, weathered by years of double shifts, betrayed her. As she reached out to steady herself, Tommy's hand lashed out, a cruel, open-palmed strike that sent her glasses skittering across the porch. The impact forced her back down onto the hard wood, the breath leaving her lungs in a pained gasp. Through the blur of her vision, she saw Molly frozen in the yard, the child's eyes wide with a terror no 8-year-old should ever know. "Molly, run!" Ellen had managed to choke out, her hand clutching her chest as a dull, blooming pain radiated behind her ribs. Tommy didn't even look at the girl. He pushed past the fallen woman, his shoulder catching her wounded side as he kicked the front door open, the sound of splintering would echoing like a gunshot. He wanted the petty cash she kept in the jar behind the flour. He wanted to feel like a king in a house that wasn't his. As Molly's red sweater vanished into the darkness of the street, Ellen stayed on the steps, her vision swimming, praying that the world would send her granddaughter a miracle. She didn't know yet that the miracle wore a black suit and carried a name that made even men like Tommy Rohr wake up in a cold sweat. In the high-rise glass towers of the city's financial district, Kang Jae-Won was known as a venture capitalist with an impeccable eye for growth. But in the neon-soaked alleys and the industrial ports, he was the dragon of the East Side, the sovereign of a syndicate that operated with the surgical precision of a Swiss watch. The Korean mafia didn't deal in the chaotic, messy violence of street gangs. They dealt in the architecture of power. Kang's world was governed by Kibun, a delicate balance of pride, mood, and social harmony. To maintain that balance, he had long ago established a cold, ironclad rule of non-interference. He didn't care about the petty squabbles of the slums. He didn't care about the small-time pushers or the desperate gamblers. In Kang's philosophy, the ecosystem of the city required both the lion and the scavenger to survive, provided they stayed out of his light. Intervening in local domestic disputes was seen as a sign of weakness, a waste of the immense resources he spent years cultivating. "A king does not swat flies," he would often tell his lieutenants. His men were trained to be shadows, present, lethal, but entirely indifferent to the suffering of those who didn't exist on their balance sheets. His neutrality was his greatest shield. It allowed him to negotiate with mayors and police commissioners who could pretend his empire didn't exist as long as the bodies didn't pile up in the wrong zip codes. This calculated distance was a cage he had built for himself, a way to bury the memories of a childhood spent in the shadow of a father who was too soft, and paid for it with his life in a Seoul back alley. But as he sat in the back of the SUV, the heavy silence of his bodyguards pressing in on him, the code of the dragon felt suddenly strangely hollow. Every manual on leadership he had ever followed dictated that he should hand this child a $100 bill and tell a subordinate to call a social worker. That was the professional choice. That was the safe choice. Yet, as he looked at Molly through the window, her red sweater a defiant spark of life in the gloom, he saw the one thing his code couldn't account for: pure, unadulterated trust. She didn't see a criminal mastermind or a ghost. She saw a man who looked like he could stop the rain if he wanted to. Kang adjusted the silk tie at his throat, the fabric feeling like a noose. By turning those SUVs toward Ellen Holder's house, he wasn't just breaking a rule. He was dismantling a decade of carefully constructed armor. He was choosing to be a man instead of a monument, and in his world that was the most dangerous gamble of all. The bodyguards in the front seat exchanged a single, wary glance. They knew that once the dragon intervened for a stranger, the world would never fear his indifference again. They were no longer just a motorcade. They were a war party, and the target was a man who had no idea that his petty cruelty had just invited a hurricane to his doorstep. The car door didn't just open. It glided on silent hinges, releasing a scent of expensive sandalwood and cold leather into the humid night. Kang Jae-Won stepped out, his presence immediately pulling the oxygen from the street. His bodyguards formed a living wall of charcoal wool behind him, but Kang's eyes were locked on the small, trembling figure in red. He didn't tower over her. Instead, the man who had never bowed to a rival boss or a crooked politician slowly lowered himself. The fabric of his bespoke trousers creased as he sank onto one knee, a gesture so uncharacteristic that his lead lieutenant, Kim, shifted his weight in silent shock. At this level, the world looked different. The towering SUVs became silhouettes of armor, and the child before him became the center of the universe. Kang reached out his hands, etched with the ink of a life spent in violence, hovering for a second before gently steadying Molly's shoulders. He didn't pull her closer. He simply anchored her. Up close, the damage was visceral. He saw the salt trails of dried tears on her medium-dark skin and the way her puffy, glossy eyes darted toward the tattoos on his neck. He felt the vibration of her terror through the palms of his hands, a frantic, bird-like thrumming that reached through his tailored sleeves and struck a chord he thought he'd severed decades ago. Molly's eyebrows were pulled upward in a mask of grief, her mouth slightly open as she fought for a breath that wouldn't catch. She looked at him not with the calculated suspicion of the adults in his world, but with a raw, terrifying hope. In that silence, Kang didn't see a case or a tactical problem to be solved. He saw the reflection of a boy in Seoul who had once prayed for a giant to emerge from the shadows when his own mother's cries filled their thin-walled kitchen. The ghost of Seoul vanished, replaced by a man who realized that every cent he had earned and every drop of blood he had spilled had led him to this specific curb, at this specific hour. This wasn't a job. It wasn't a matter of territory or Kibun. It was a calling, the only one that mattered. "Look at me," Kang said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. Molly's gaze steadied, her dark, tear-filled eyes meeting his sharp, intense ones. He didn't offer a hollow smile. He offered the truth of his power. "The man who was in your house, is he still there?" Molly nodded, a single tear spilling over and tracking down her cheek. She leaned subtly toward him, her hunched shoulders relaxing just a fraction as she felt the immovable strength in his grip. "Then he has already lost," Kang whispered. It was a promise made not to the child, but to the universe. He stood up, the transition fluid and lethal, and for the first time that night, the gentleness in his eyes was replaced by a fire that made his men instinctively reach for their lapels. He didn't look back at the club. He looked toward the end of the street where the shadows were thickest. The neighborhood didn't hear the motorcade before they saw it. The three black SUVs moved with a ghostly, synchronized hum that felt more like a physical pressure than a sound. They cut through the gloom of the Riverside district, their high-intensity LEDs carving paths through the hazy air like searchlights. When they reached the curb in front of Ellen Holder's home, they didn't just stop, they occupied the space. Jeffrey was already back, standing on the bottom step with his jaw set and his fists clenched so tight the tattoos on his forearms seemed to ripple. He had returned to find the door splintered and the silence of the house screaming of a struggle. His chest, broad and scarred under his white undershirt, was heaving with a protective rage that had nowhere to go. When the lead vehicle screeched to a halt, Jeffrey stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel, ready to face whatever new threat had arrived to finish what the first one started. He expected a fight. He expected loud, chaotic thugs looking for trouble. Instead, the doors opened in a perfect, chilling unison. 6 men stepped out. They didn't shout, they didn't brandish weapons. They simply moved into a tactical perimeter, their dark overcoats fluttering slightly in the wind. Their faces were masks of absolute, expressionless discipline. They didn't look like street fighters. They looked like a professional army dressed for a funeral. Jeffrey froze, his hand halfway to the railing. He had spent his life in the rougher parts of the city, but he had never seen this kind of order. It was the silence of the bodyguards that unnerved him, the way they ignored him entirely, focusing their eyes on the house with a predatory stillness. Then the center SUV door opened, and Kang Jae-Won stepped out. Beside him stood Molly, her small hand now tucked into the massive, tattooed hand of the boss. The contrast was staggering. The muscular man in the tank top, sweating and ready for a brawl, and the billionaire in a 3-piece suit who looked like he had just stepped out of a boardroom into a war zone. Jeffrey's gaze shifted from the sharp, slicked-back hair of the Korean boss to the terrified, tear-streaked face of the little girl. The tension in his shoulders didn't disappear, but it shifted. He saw the way Kang's men stood, not one of them out of place, not one of them looking away from their objective. This wasn't a gang raid, it was a reckoning. "Who are you?" Jeffrey asked, his voice low and wary, his eyes darting to the SUVs that now hemmed in the entire block. Kang didn't answer immediately. He looked at the shattered door, then at the blue floral fabric of Ellen's dress visible through the shadows of the porch. He squeezed Molly's hand once, a brief, grounding gesture, before looking Jeffrey in the eye. "I am the man who is going to make sure your friend never has to hold her chest in pain again," Kang said. The authority in his voice was absolute. Jeffrey stepped aside, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, profound realization that he was no longer the most dangerous man on the porch. The dragon had arrived, and as his bodyguards moved to flank the entrance in a silent, synchronized sweep, the air in the Riverside district grew cold with the promise of what was about to happen inside. Kang Jae-Won signaled for his men to remain at the perimeter. This was not a moment for a siege. It was a moment for a presence. He stepped over the threshold, his polished shoes crunching softly on the splintered remains of the doorframe. The interior of the house was a sharp contrast to the cold, mechanical efficiency of his SUVs. It smelled of lavender, old books, and the sudden, acrid scent of spilled beer. The hallway was a tunnel of dim, yellow light. At the far end, silhouetted against the kitchen window, stood Tommy Rohr. He was clutching a handful of crumpled bills and a small gold locket. His face twisted into a smirk that hadn't yet realized the world had changed. He saw the suit first and let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "What are you, the landlord? You're late. I already collected." Kang didn't stop walking. He moved with a measured, predatory grace, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. As he passed under a flickering overhead bulb, the light hit the sharp line of his jaw and the black ink of the dragon's tail coiling up his neck. The smirk on Tommy's face didn't just fade. It disintegrated. He looked at the tailored wool of Kang's suit, then at the tattoos that signaled a history of violence far beyond the petty thuggery of the Riverside district. This wasn't a man who called the police. This was the man the police were afraid to call. The air in the narrow hallway grew heavy, the atmospheric pressure seemingly rising with every step Kang took. Tommy's hand, still clutching the stolen locket, began to shake. "Look, man, I don't know who you are, but I've got no beef with you. The old lady owed me. It's business. Business." Kang's voice was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards themselves. He stopped just 3 feet away, his shadow swallowing Tommy whole. "In my world, business is conducted with honor. What you did here, that is just the scratching of a rat." The intruder backed away until he hit the kitchen counter, his eyes darting frantically toward the back door. But the shadow in the hallway was absolute. Kang didn't raise his voice, and he didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stood there, an immovable monument of controlled fury. The tattoos on his hands, visible as he adjusted his cuffs, seemed to pulse in the low light. To Tommy, the man in the black suit didn't look human. He looked like a judgment that had been delayed for too long. "Drop the locket," Kang commanded. The sound of the gold hitting the linoleum floor was the only noise in the house. A tiny, metallic chime that signaled the end of Tommy Rohr's reign of terror. He was a man who lived by fear, but for the first time in his life, he was looking into the eyes of someone who truly owned it. Kang Jae-Won didn't have to strike a blow to win the room. His mere presence had turned the predator into the prey, and the hallway, once a place of domestic peace, had become a chamber of reckoning. Kang stepped out from the oppressive shadow of the hallway and onto the porch, where the night air was still and heavy. He found Ellen seated on the top step, her frame looking smaller and more fragile than it had through the SUV's tinted glass. She was leaning against the railing, one hand still pressed firmly over her heart, as if trying to keep her spirit from escaping through the cracks Tommy Rohr had made. The sight of her, the modesty of her blue floral dress now wrinkled and stained with the dust of the porch, caused a surge of heat to rise in Kang's chest. It was a cold, white-hot fury, the kind that usually ended with a city block in ashes and a name erased from the records. His jaw tightened so hard the tendons in his neck strained against his silk tie, and for a fleeting second, the ghost threatened to take complete control. He wanted to turn back into the house and ensure that the man cowering in the kitchen never saw the sunrise. But as he approached, Ellen lifted her gaze. Her eyes, though clouded with pain and exhaustion, held a clarity that stopped him in his tracks. She didn't look at him with the terror Tommy had. She looked at him with a profound, weary sadness. "Don't," she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound, yet it cut through the roaring in his ears like a blade. Kang froze, his hand hovering near the railing. "He has to pay, Elena. This world only understands a debt when it is collected in blood." Ellen shook her head slowly, a pained wince flickering across her face as she did. "If you go back in there with death in your heart, then you're just another man breaking a door. My Molly." She didn't run to find a killer. She ran to find a savior. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she grazed the sleeve of his expensive wool suit. "Don't let him take your peace too. He's already taken enough of ours." The fire in Kang's gut didn't vanish, but it shifted. He looked at her hand, weathered, honest and kind, resting against the fabric that symbolized his cold, calculated empire. Her gentle spirit acted as a dam against the flood of his rage. He realized that if he crossed the threshold again to deliver the final blow, he would be betraying the very trust Molly had placed in him. He would be the monster the world expected, rather than the guardian the child needed. He took a deep breath, the scent of the evening rain finally reaching his lungs, and slowly knelt beside her. The intensity in his eyes remained, but the lethal edge had softened into a grim, protective resolve. "He will go," Kang promised, his voice low and steady. "But he will go because you are the stronger one here, not me." He signaled to Jeffrey, who was watching from the yard with wide eyes, to come and help her up. As Jeffrey's powerful arms gently lifted the elderly woman, Kang stood, his silhouette tall and imposing against the moon. He had been stopped from becoming a monster, but he was still a king, and he was about to ensure that the peace Ellen Holder so desperately wanted was bought and paid for in a way that Tommy Rohr would never forget. Kang Jae-Won turned back toward the house, his face a mask of stone that betrayed none of the mercy Ellen had just requested. He didn't reach for the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, black smartphone, tapping a single command. Within moments, Kim, his most trusted lieutenant, appeared at his shoulder, holding a slim leather folder and a heavy, gold-plated pen. They found Tommy Rohr still pinned against the kitchen counter, his breath coming in ragged, terrified hitches. He looked at the folder as if it were a death warrant. In Kang's world, it was something much more permanent. "You think you are a collector, Tommy?" Kang said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade against the skin. "But tonight, you are the one who is over-leveraged. Every dollar you took from this neighborhood, every locket you snatched, every ounce of fear you traded in, it has a price. And I am here to buy the debt." Kang signaled to Kim, who opened the folder to reveal a series of notarized documents. They weren't just for Ellen's stolen rent. They were transfer deeds and confession statements. Kang had spent the last 20 minutes on the phone with his legal team, systematically dismantling Tommy's life from the top down. "Sign," Kang commanded. Tommy fumbled for the pen, his fingers slick with sweat. I don't have this kind of money. I don't own anything." "You own a car. You own a lease on a shop that sells stolen parts. You own a reputation," Kang countered, his eyes boring into Tommy's soul. "As of this moment, you own nothing. You are signing over every asset, every cent in your accounts, and the titles to your properties to a community trust one have established for this block. You are paying back every person you have ever touched, with interest." The scratching of the pen was the only sound in the room, a desperate, frantic noise that signaled the erasure of a predator. Once the last page was turned, Kang took the folder back. He leaned in close, the tattoos on his neck mere inches from Tommy's face. "You are leaving this city tonight, not with a bullet because a woman far better than you asked for your life. But if I see your shadow in this district again, or if I hear that you have so much as looked at another grandmother with malice, I will not be the one who comes for you. My reach is long, Tommy, and my memory is longer." Kang turned his back, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He didn't need to see Tommy scurry out the back door. He knew the man was already a ghost. As he stepped back out onto the porch, the folder tucked under his arm, he saw Molly waiting by the SUV. The weight of the world's cruelty had been lifted from the house, replaced by a cold, expensive justice that the courts could never provide. He had used his wealth to buy a neighborhood's peace, and for the first time in his life, the dragon felt the heavy, quiet satisfaction of a debt truly settled. The heavy, tactical tension that had gripped the block began to dissipate, replaced by a surreal, quiet stillness. Kang Jae-Won stood on the porch, a silent sentinel watching the street, but the real transformation was happening beside the lead SUV. There, under the amber glow of a street lamp, the men who had arrived as a terrifying omen of death were undergoing a shift that no one in the Riverside district could have predicted. Molly stood by the rear door of the vehicle, her small fingers nervously stroking the matted fur of her teddy bear. The bear had tumbled into the dirt during the chaos, its brown fur stained with the grime of the street, and its left ear hanging by a single, fragile thread. To the world, it was a piece of cheap polyester. To Molly, it was the only witness to her courage. Kim, the lieutenant who usually spent his days calculating the logistics of international shipping and the mechanics of a silent takeover, noticed the girl's downcast gaze. He shared a look with Park, the youngest of the crew, a man whose dark sunglasses usually hid eyes that had seen the worst of the Seoul docks. Without a word, the two men stepped out of their rigid formation. The order had a new priority. Park reached into the glove compartment of the luxury vehicle, pulling out a small, silk-lined cleaning kit meant for the car's premium leather interior. He knelt beside Molly, his movements slow and deliberate, ensuring he didn't startle her. With a precision usually reserved for cleaning a high-caliber firearm, he used a soft microfiber cloth and a gentle solution to dab away the mud from the bear's paws. Molly watched, her mouth slightly agape, as the man in the sharp black suit treated her toy with the reverence of a holy relic. Kim, meanwhile, reached into his suit jacket and produced a small silver pocket knife. For a moment, Jeffrey tensed on the porch, but Kim wasn't reaching for a weapon. He found a stray thread from his own silk tie and, with a dexterity that spoke of a childhood spent in a tailor's shop, he began to deftly stitch the bear's ear back into place. The other bodyguards remained in their perimeter, their backs turned to the scene, but their posture had softened. They were no longer guarding a crime boss. They were guarding a moment of restored childhood. One of them even produced a small, wrapped piece of Korean candy from his pocket, silently handing it to Molly as if it were a top-secret communique. Molly clutched the cleaned, repaired bear to her chest, the scent of expensive car leather now mixed with its familiar fluff. She looked up at the men in their dark glasses and saw, for the first time, not the shadows of the city, but men who had mothers and sisters of their own. She offered a small, shy smile, a tiny flicker of light that seemed to reflect in the polished finish of the SUV. Kang watched from the stairs, his arms crossed, his face remaining a mask of discipline. But as he saw Kim carefully tuck the silver knife away and Park stand back up to resume his post, the boss allowed himself a single, shallow breath of relief. The dragon's men had learned that their strength wasn't just in the damage they could inflict, but in the peace they could preserve. The debt wasn't just paid. The world was, for a fleeting moment, made whole again. The sterile, white corridors of St. Mary's Hospital were a world away from the grit of the Riverside district. Yet the presence of Kang Jae-Won made the hospital wing feel like a fortress. His men occupied the waiting area with a silent, ironclad vigilance that made the nursing staff whisper in hushed tones. But inside room 412, the air was soft, filled only with the rhythmic hum of the heart monitor and the low murmur of a child's voice. Kang stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the glowing city lights. He had traded his suit jacket for a seat by the bed, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink that marked his past. On the bed, Ellen Holder looked peaceful, the color returning to her cheeks as she slept, her hand resting over the spot where Molly had spent the last hour curled up beside her. Molly was finally asleep, her head resting on her repaired teddy bear, her small hand still clutching the sleeve of Kang's shirt. She had refused to let go since they arrived, as if she feared that if she closed her eyes, the man who had stopped the world for her would vanish back into the shadows. Kang looked down at the child's hand against his arm. For years, He had measured his worth by the weight of the fear he could inspire, by the silence that fell when he entered a room and the absolute obedience of his empire. He had built a throne of ice and stone, believing that the only way to protect what was his was to be the most dangerous thing in the dark. But as he watched Molly's chest rise and fall in a deep, safe slumber, he realized he had been wrong. Fear was a brittle thing. It broke under pressure or turned into resentment. But this quiet, unyielding trust was a power he hadn't prepared for. He looked at the bruises on Ellen's face and then back at Molly. He had spent his life trying to avoid being like his father, trying to be hard enough to survive. Yet, in the eyes of an 8-year-old girl, he wasn't a criminal, a boss, or a ghost. He was simply the man who came when she called. The realization hit him with more force than any rival strike. Being a good man to Molly was a far more demanding and far more powerful legacy than being the most feared man in the city. It required a different kind of strength, the strength to stay, to protect, and to be worthy of the hand currently holding his sleeve. He reached out with his free hand, gently brushing a stray curl from Molly's forehead. His touch was no longer the calculated gesture of a leader, but the honest promise of a guardian. He knew the neighborhood would still whisper his name with awe, and his enemies would still tremble at his shadow. But as the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the hospital room in hues of gold and hope, Kang Jae-Won finally accepted his new title. He wasn't just the dragon of the East Side anymore. He was the silent sentinel of a small, red-sweatered girl and her grandmother. And as he sat there in the quiet dawn, he knew that for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The debt was paid, the family was safe, and the ghost had finally found a home. What was your take from this story? What would you like to add or remove from this? Let us know in the comments below. Do not forget to like and subscribe to the Cinema Corner channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.